Hello. Welcome to the Art and Technology panel at the Santa Cruz Film Festival. We have a distinguished group of people here today. In fact, we have so many great people here, I think I want to turn it into a series. But the idea of art and technology is something we'll be discussing, as well as the individual projects that people are working on and why they're here today. And I'll introduce the people first of all. This is Son Lundell, Drew DETWEILER, and Lyles, who I don't know as well, BELHOCINE, BELHOCINE, ALLAN LUNDELL, and myself, Denise Gallant, and Frank Serafine, Marco Alpert, Peter Elsey, and my husband, Kevin Monahan. And we are technology.
Okay, my name is Son Lundell, and I am with Muse Cinemedia, which is a small artist-owned company here in Santa Cruz. So that's our art.
And actually, I'll jump over to Allan. Because how I know the two of you is you really have, from the very beginning, I mean, you have tapes. Allan has always had a camera in his hand from the moment I saw him.
Sure. I have pretty much every day, and have these.
Doing it right now.
Yeah, I'm doing it right now. It's an obsession. I wish I could explain it, but what's interesting is that I have gotten into editing, and I have started to tell a lot of stories, especially of our community and Silicon Valley. I've been a Silicon Valley journalist in the past, and I have tracked this whole evolution from analog to digital, you know, on a daily basis. So it's an interesting archive, and a lot of very amazing people in this part of the planet that have been evolving the technology, many of whom I've had a chance to get to know and document. So for me, the technology has been not so much about being in the studios like this, but having the portable gear that goes out into the real world and captures what's going on in the real world.
And feeding it back to the real world immediately.
Exactly.
As immediately as you could 30 years ago, even till now.
Exactly. And if you look at my Facebook page right now, you're already on it. All of you, actually. So I have embraced the Facebook technology, the Twitter technology most recently, and be happy to discuss some elements of that on this panel. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, and Drew and LYES are a team, but you could also talk about yourself individually. So.
Okay. My name is Drew DETWEILER. I'm currently describing myself as an interdisciplinary artist, activist, and educator. My primary medium is digital video, and that takes many different forms. Currently, I'm designing immersive video environments, but really my roots are in social documentary work rooted in Theater of the Oppressed inspired workshops. When I say activist, I'm trying to connect communities with limited access to technology and provide tools and training so that communities can represent themselves through different forms of new media. And I also create video for interdisciplinary performance with musicians and dancers. I'm a recent graduate of the Digital Arts and New Media program at UC Santa Cruz. This is where I had the pleasure to work with Peter Elsey, who you're going to meet in a second. And I met LYES BELHOCINE, and we've become partners. My thesis work, basically, I developed a VJ application that I took to Brazil and worked with youth there to represent themselves through music videos, through found images on the internet, interpreting their lyrics of their favorite songs through a custom application I developed with Peter and LYES. And now this is extended to the point where we're developing DJ-VJ interfaces and trying to make creative, intuitive interfaces to open up remix culture to people that don't have prior experiences doing that type of work.
Okay, LYES.
So, hi, my name is LYES BELHOCINE. I'm a recent graduate from the Digital Arts and New Media program at UCSC, and I am still actually affiliated with DANM because I am a research associate there. That consists of continuing a body of work that we started when we were still there. So, like Drew introduced it, we were working together at UCSC and then continued when we were done to develop these new interactive tools. This is what I've been doing since, well, way back now that I can think about it. It started all with making electronic music, and then I wanted to have more control over the parameters, and I wanted to always add a live performance aspect to it, and I'm a big fan of random and not predicting what's going to happen. So I started learning more about technology. I learned how to program, and also later now I've been getting into building my own interfaces, because you're never better served than by yourself. So I was thinking, why wouldn't I just do it myself? So I started by making a lot of audio little tools, and then I met with Drew and we started making both audio and video. I like to explore new ways of manipulating media, whether it is audio or video, and more importantly, I like to see what people do with that. So very often what we do is participate in little festivals. We like to take our tools out, give them to people, not tell them anything, and just observe how they react with it. And we have discovered that a lot of people are more and more technology illiterate, but like Drew said, we're also thinking the big picture and think about the access of technology and more globally, meaning in other parts of the world. So we're also trying to make stuff that can be used to give people who have less access to technology a voice, because of social media and all these things that are now emerging, where it's very important to know how to shoot a video or edit it very fast and stuff like that. So that's what we're doing.
Okay, I knew there'd be no trouble with people talking about what they do. I was like, that's just the beginning. Wait to the other side of the table. So anyway, just to let people know, my name is Denise Gallant, and I have been working with technology and art for 40 years or so. My thing was initially film. I went to UCLA Film School and UCSC, but involved more in the electronic music department. What we did was, my partner at that time, Rob Schaefer, who's at CBS in New York, at that time we would develop circuits. And the circuits were to pick up audio and manipulate video in some way. So, and it was often used in live performance. So I was kind of like the predecessor, a little bit of what you're talking about now. I had my own little company, Synopsis Video. We went to LA. I did rock videos, and I still do rock videos. And my husband, Kevin Monahan, and I have our own little company, Video 4 in Santa Cruz. And that's all I'll talk about myself. Okay, but next to me right here is Frank Serafine, and I will just show you quickly a little bit about Frank. He just gave me this HD Video Pro magazine, and he's in this last month, and so he's one of our stars on the panel here. Okay, that's Frank in the past, that's Frank now. And this is his studio. He did sound effects for Tron, Hunt for Red October, and many more. So, Frank, here you go.
Thanks, Denise. Let's see. I started my career back in Colorado as a musician, and played guitar and later flute. And my first synthesizer was a Mellotron. Which when I was 16 years old, we wrote to the Moody Blues fan club and found out how they created orchestra for all of these incredible pieces that they had written. We knew that it wasn't a real orchestra because of the way it sounded. So I was one of the first kids in Colorado at 16 years old to have a Mellotron. I didn't even have a car.
And it costs the same, right?
Yeah. Producers would pick me up, we'd put the Mellotron in the trunk, and I'd be off to a session. So that was really like the beginning of my use of technology, really a musician, and started working. My first synthesizer was a Moog synthesizer. And so I had my Mellotron and my Moog, and I was just playing in bands in Colorado, and I was always interested in doing film. And the Fisk Planetarium in Boulder had just opened up, and I dragged my Mellotron into the planetarium, and the president of the planetarium, they turned on the Star Machine, and I started playing like all these incredible chords and everything, and they were like, wow, this is incredible stuff. So we were able to perform at that planetarium, and Disney talent scouts from Disneyland came out and saw one of my shows, and they ended up hiring me to come to Disneyland, and that's where I met Marco for the first time. That was 1977. And at that point, I was still really working with electronic musical instruments as for music. As I moved from Colorado to Hollywood, since I'd served my country and worked for Disney.
Is that one and the same?
Yeah. I kind of got my foot in the door of the Disney productions up in Buena Vista, and I was creating sound effects for The Black Hole. And I kind of used that film to get me into Paramount, because once I saw The Black Hole, it was kind of a turkey movie. And but they didn't know that at Paramount, so I used that as a leverage to get Star Trek. And I ended up at the age of like 23. I was the youngest person on the Star Trek team. Everybody on Star Trek were in their 50s or 60s at the time. Robert Wise, who had directed the film and The Sound of Music, was probably 70 years old. So I was really kind of the youngest kid on the block, because I could create sounds that no one had ever heard before.
Okay, that's the point.
Creating synthesized
panel.
sounds, and the rest of the sound editors who'd been in the industry for many more years than me were creating with natural sounds, taking mag and turning it backwards, and natural effects, which I later got into quite extensively. But at the time, I was able to create sounds that had never been heard before on a Moog synthesizer, which is really like the beginning of synthesis. And that started my sound design career in Hollywood. And I've always been really a musician, creative musician, with my approach towards technology, and have used, even to today, create all the sound effects for these feature films, and I've done over 50 films, using electronic musical instruments to create special sounds. And now I've always, being involved in these big special effects films, I've always gravitated towards visual effects. I love visual effects. And now with the software that's available, companies like Wirecast, Telestream allow you to be able to have your own television studio, switching between multi-cameras like what we're doing here, all in a $1,000 package. Gen Arts company creates fantastic, Sapphire and all these different visual effects, are now allowing me as a creative musician sound designer to be able to actually incorporate these visual effects into what I'm doing, and because I can. Now I can afford it, it's easy to operate, and I'm starting to become more of a self-contained artist, where I can create my own visual effects, my own music, and my own sound effects production. So I'm becoming a self-contained artist, where I don't have to really rely on anybody else to be able to get my own content out.
Okay.
So that's where I'm moving.
Okay. Okay, so the next person is Marco Alpert, and Marco is the only true technologist really on this panel, even though you are an artist. And you have the infamous presence to be in a company that also is kind of an interesting subject in itself. So tell us.
Right. Well, I'm currently with Antares Audio Technologies, the purveyor of the infamous auto-tune pitch correction technology, which has sort of exploded onto the pop culture scene, for better or worse, these past few years. We actually do a lot of other things as well, but that's what most people outside of the industry know us for. I've actually been in the musical technology arena for well over 30 years, but before that I was actually a musician as well, kind of pursuing a lot of the same things that Frank was. I did music for film, sound design for both film and professional theater down in LA. And my first, just to be fair, to represent both sides, my first synthesizer was an ARP, so there. And in the search for a better synthesizer, I discovered a couple of crazy young guys who were making their own synthesizer, which amazed me that anybody could just make their own synthesizers. Scott Wedge and Dave Rossum, who formed a little company called EMU Systems. And in the mid-'70s, I kind of made a little more money than I was making at the film stuff, which was really easy to do by selling some of the representing EMU synthesizers down in LA. And in '79, they had moved to Santa Cruz in the meantime and asked me to come up and work for them. And I agreed to come up here for 1 year because I didn't want to really give up on my career altogether. So I came up in '79 to work for them for a year and never left Santa Cruz.
Right. It happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does happen, exactly. So I was lucky enough to be at EMU up here for about 15 years during a time when EMU was largely responsible for popularizing the technology of digital sampling as the premier method of electronic music production in the transition from analog synthesizers, which EMU also made fabulous analog synthesizers. But we moved through digital sampling, and it was very exciting times, still are very exciting times, actually. Spent a few years at the electronic music division of Akai Electronics, where I'm sort of largely responsible for them making the MPC 2000. It's funny, as someone who is about as far from the hip-hop world as conceivably possible, I've now been associated with the SP1200 at EMU, which was a hip-hop icon, the MPC 2000 at Akai, which is a hip-hop icon, and now, of course, the Autotune effect, which has become a hip-hop icon. Now, finally, all these decades later, I'm sort of cool to my kids, which I never was at the time.
They appreciate you now. Okay.
So I've been lucky enough to basically be involved in this industry through a tremendous transition from a point of view where music production was something arcane and incredibly expensive, and maybe you could save up your money and get a couple of hours in studios that cost $150 an hour, to the point where everybody can now have technology that puts those multi-million-dollar studios to shame sitting in their personal computer in their bedroom. And I think there's no greater indication of just what technology has done to the democratization of art than that
Which is
that
actually
transition.
our subject of the panel.
Exactly.
Eventually.
Exactly.
Okay,
So
great.
that's it for me.
Okay, and Peter Elsey from UCSC. So,
Well, I have been in the ivory tower for all of these years, staying away from actually having to sell my products, which means I don't have to be practical. I don't have to hit a certain budget mark, and I don't have to sell a million copies. The university seems happy to keep employing me no matter what I waste my time on. So I have been working for 40 years now, starting in Iowa and then moving to UC Santa Cruz in 1980, in basically the development of tools for making music and now art through whatever the cutting edge technology of the day is. Beginning with Moog synthesizers, EMU synthesizers. I built synthesizers based on some things. Before they sold a complete synthesizer, they were selling some of their kits to parts, and I was building their parts into synthesizers that were going into music labs and universities. Up through developing computer-based music systems, and then finally going into programming systems when my soldering iron sat cool for many years while all the work was done with compilers and high-end processors. And lately I have warmed up the soldering iron again because I've become involved in developing new interfaces for performance, both in terms of musical performance and in artistic performance. For instance, my current project is a wheelchair. I have a colleague who is wheelchair bound, and we have converted his chair into a performance instrument by putting wheel encoders and little magnetic sensors on various parts of it, so that as he rolls around on the stage, he can cue various actions or have sound generation proportional to his speed as he rolls across the stage and such things. Some of you may have seen me testing the system last week where I put wheels on a broom and was pushing the broom around stage, generating sounds in various styles and strangeness proportional to my actions or inactivity at any given time.
okay, great. Okay, this is a whole subject I want to get back to as far as creating tools. But Kevin Monahan.
I'm Kevin Monahan. And my background also started with audio and synthesis and a love and interest for music synthesizers and mellotron, which mellotron is not really a synthesizer as much as a tape-based instrument that plays sounds from tape, violins, flutes, cellos, things like that. Yeah, and I didn't even know what it was. I used to buy albums that said mellotron on it, just because they had either, if they said synthesizer or mellotron, I would get it. And my first synthesizer was an Oberheim. And it led me to working at EMU, and at the time I started, synthesis was not as interesting as the mellotron technology, but it turned out EMU was moving into that direction, and that became very inspiring that I was going to be part of this new frontier to make a digital mellotron. And the first emulator was 128 kilobytes of memory, and we thought we could do a mellotron with 128 kilobytes of memory. And about 10 years later, when we got up to 32 megabyte emulator systems, then you could actually start to really do a mellotron. But everything was about trying to preserve sound quality and make instruments work in very small, compact space. And now the same thing's happening in video, where I've migrated into a video production company. We have our company called Video 4, and we do video editing, and all the same problems that we had to, and challenges in audio, I find repeating themselves now with video. And finally the technology is video's always been behind audio by a few years, and at this point it's like everything's kind of caught up, where the computers and the power that you have in your own room now, you can do what you could only do in a professional situation before, and now everybody has this power.
So I was going to go to the idea that pretty much all of us in some way are creating our own tools, or taking what is there and expounding on that. And that's what we did, my friend Rob and I, and Kevin helped too, in the mid to late 70s. We took all the chips that were available at that time and created our own electronic synthesizers for video at that time. So it was kind of like the Cadillac of analog synthesis. And the whole idea, though, was to take ideas that we saw in our head that we knew were possible because these chips were suddenly invented, and to make 8-level keyers, which didn't exist in a standard studio, or a 720-degree color wheel, so that as you plugged in a video, it was rainbow hues all through the video. So things like that. And so I guess I'll open it up to all of you, whoever wants to talk about that, in terms of what they're either did in the past to now, or what they're thinking about now for the future as far as creating your own tools and pushing that envelope.
Well,
okay, go ahead.
I'll push.
Okay.
What I see right now in my interactions with my students, I run a very active electronic music studio with 50 undergraduate students running around all the time, bringing me their problems. And what I've seen now is that although we have wonderful sound manipulation tools, and we have wonderful image manipulation tools, we can basically create any sound that you can imagine. We can create fairly easily. Any image can be captured, any image can be modified in the wonderful myriad of dazzling ways. But what we've lost track of, or we're not keeping up, the part of it that's not keeping up with, is the part where actual human beings interact. If you look at our traditional musical instruments, like the violin, you see something that was carefully refined over centuries and has become an instrument that is so intimately connected to the performer that basically the performer thinks of what they want to do and it happens. The electronic world is nowhere near as facile. And what I'm doing in my work is researching new technologies, new approaches that can get us away from the traditional, because although violin is a beautiful instrument, it has many drawbacks. First off, it takes many, many years to master. It is fairly limited in what it can do. It will always sound like a violin. And it is also crippling in its use. You have to do this for hours and hours a day, and that will cripple you. So with the new technology available, we have things now that allow us to simply touch a surface. Okay, what does that surface feel like to give us the feedback that we can get from a violin? Can that be something that's useful? Can we make it so that a touch surface, can I make a program for an iPad that is as flexible and as intuitive as a violin in the work? Well, I don't know, but that's the direction that I'm researching, to see where we can go, to see how we can take new technologies, find new modalities to interact with all this wonderful production expertise we have now.
Have you explored the Connect box?
Yes, I have a Connect on my desk at work.
It seems to be very hackable, and a lot of people are doing amazing things with it.
It's very hackable, and you can do wonderful things. I've got an application I was demonstrating yesterday where I hold my hands like this and play. Huh. And I'm looking at an image of myself in a reflected TV monitor so I can see a keyboard there as I play. And so I'm playing.
What is a Connect
for
box?
the uninitiated, the Connect box is a new peripheral for the, I think it's the Microsoft
Xbox
360.
Yeah.
And it picks up gesture language. If you move like this or like this, it will translate into computer control.
Yeah, it knows how far away you are. Basically, it creates two images. One is a picture of you. Right. The other is a distance map, so that it knows that if the Connect was here, it knows that it's 30 centimeters to this bottle. It knows that it's 60 centimeters to my chest. I move my arm forward, it catches that, and I can work with that.
Yeah.
And you can make it so it works in a very, very thin slice. If you go on YouTube, you'll find Tim Thompson has put up some very interesting videos with this Connect where he puts up big window frames. Mm. And basically you touch the window frame or the area in the window frame at some point, the Connect reacts to that, generates music, and does interesting kinds of things. So it's a very a fun modality. I don't think it has future. I think it's going to suffer the same fate as theremin. Which is the fact that, yes, in the theremin, which is a very old technology, it's radio-based, 70 years old, you hold your hands here, you put your hands there, you move your hands around. It turns out to be extremely difficult to play because it's quite difficult to be very precise in where your hands are.
Okay, so I want to get a few other voices here. I mean, I'm thinking guitar products here, and I'm thinking cubes over here. So who wants to go first? You go.
Well, I'm not really sure that, Antares, it's not really a secret. We're actually teasing this out to the world this very weekend, but Antares has been focusing on the human voice for the last 10 years at any rate. Actually before that, but we're mostly known for human voice. We did a lot of other things, and in fact, in the way that a lot of people on this panel have connections that go back into the past, one of the things that allowed Kevin to squish so many of those sounds into so little memory was a program called Infinity that the founder of Antares made way back when that revolutionized how looping could be done.
Which came out of the oil industry.
Yeah, as a matter of fact. And I don't think we ever would have gotten those tremendous variety and quality of sounds into the original Proteus, which was the first affordable sound module that put essentially the equivalent of the code name was Band in a Box back then, but it had a rather huge collection of most of the sounds you needed to do a wide range of pop music in a single little 1U rack space for under $1,000, and it would do 32 voices at a time, 16 different timbres, so you could actually create the entire composition in this one little box. And Kevin was largely responsible for squishing all those sounds in there, and the way he was able to squish all those sounds in there is a lot of them were looped with Infinity that was created by Antares. So we're doing a lot of amazing things, but there's a lot of people that have really interesting little interactions and history going back there.
And why I was thinking of guitar products, we can talk about that.
Yeah, we can talk about it, yeah.
Is that you were talking about the violin and how the violin has its own sensitivity and it's really the human interface that makes it happen. Well, in that case, it's just the opposite with what you're doing now. You're actually putting guitars in tune for the first time in 1,000 years. Is that how it goes?
Or in perfect intonation.
Yeah.
Turning an imperfect instrument into a perfect instrument.
Or the imperfect person behind the instrument to the perfect instrument.
I think one of the issues, and I think it goes to what you say, is there's this dichotomy between people doing really tremendously creative things with human interface to this technology. It's I don't know if anyone's aware of this, but Roger Lynn, the inventor of the Lindrum, has been traveling around as we speak doing these workshops where he's presenting a variety of current alternate controllers. He has something called the Linstrument, which is in fact a flat touch pad that unlike an iPad that doesn't have pressure sensitivity, it has basically 3D control, where basically it tracks where your finger is and how hard individually for each of 10 fingers. So he's set that up into a grid, and you can define your scales any way you want, and it opens up an entirely new level of control. He's also presenting, I think really the one commercial product along this line is something called the Eigenharp. Is anyone here familiar with the Eigenharp? Amazingly, a company in the UK has actually gotten financial backing to create an entirely new musical instrument and do it in a way that's not a homebrew thing. They've created these gorgeous instruments, and there's a number of them. Unfortunately, right now they're very expensive, but the biggest one is covered with like 105 individual buttons that are sensitive to back and forth pressure, up and down pressure, and in pressure. Individually. So you could have, assuming you've got 10 fingers, you can have 10 streams of three-dimensional control data at one time. It's got a breath controller, it's got ribbon controllers, it's got an entire system that allows you to completely reconfigure what those buttons do. It's an amazing, amazing thing, and it's really been done right because they have millions of dollars behind them. And the question is, how many people are willing to put in the effort to actually learn to take advantage of it? The thing about the violin is there's an entire, multi-hundred-year tradition of pedagogy that makes it easy. It isn't easy to play, but it's easy to find someone who will teach you to play. It's easy to look and say, here's what thousands of people have done with this instrument. Here's an enormous library of music to play, and that makes that a legitimate instrument where you have something like an Eigenharp, which is at, it's like imagine the first day someone brought a violin to someone who'd never seen a violin before and explained to them that they had to remember where to put your finger on the strings, and you got to scrape this horsehair thing about. How much excitement was that going to generate?
But don't you think we have the ability to design whole new ideas of what instruments are, musical instruments are? Maybe instruments that combine visual and audio.
I agree
Which
with
does kind of get into your thing. So tell me about the cubes. Not to jump up, but I want to hear about the cubes.
So the cubes, I think we need to go back actually before we get there, because it's kind of like the last development of a series. There's an evolution that led to building the cubes and making them work. So it all started with my fascination for the React table, and if people are not familiar with that, it's a round table on which you display different objects, and as you place them, you spin them, and depending on where they are on the table, it creates different sounds with different timbres, different instruments, and stuff like that. So the React table was really, really fascinating, and I was really lucky to get to play with one. And what happened is that I was really excited and was really looking forward to that experience. But when I got in front of it, I got really, really frustrated. Why? Because it was really hard to control. And as Peter said, it takes a lot of time to master any instrument. So when I started thinking about that, I thought they should make a version, or someone should make a version that would not be as frustrating, something that just offers instant gratification, that makes you, that will create beautiful music, and depending on what you want to do with it. So this person who built it turned out to be me, with the help of Drew. And so that was the beginning. I was like, okay, how can I build something that's kind of similar, but different enough, and more importantly, correct that frustration that I felt when I got to play with it. So I built a first piece called Sound Interesting, that it was a huge table as well. And instead of having people interact with, I wouldn't say endless number of objects that did very different things, I standardized 4 sides. First of all, I limited the number of users, because one of the problems when I was experiencing the React table is that there were 5 kids next to me touching everything, so I couldn't really figure what I was doing. So I limited the number of users. I used the square table, so I did 4 users, 1 on each side, and all the users had the same controls. They could either start or stop the sample. I used everything was done on samples. There was no live creation in order for me to be able to avoid the fact that it would turn into a sonic chaos. and that it would get out of control. So it was all sample-based. People had control over starting or stopping the sound, the volume, and certain effects like equalizer, panning. It was in a surround environment with 8 speakers, so people could actually distribute the sound in a circle, and it worked pretty well. The only problem with that is that it was huge. It was a very complicated setup, and it used a lot of resources in terms of computational power. So after that, what we did is we kept working a little bit with that interface. Our first, the first thing we did is that we literally put it on the floor and cut it in 2 because it was really high and really big, and used a better projector. At the same time, I met with Drew, who was doing an immersive environment, an immersive video environment, and he was also building multi-user mixing tools. So what we did is that we merged our 2 programs. I pretty much loaded his program into my interface and mixed it a little bit with mine. So we started making audio-visual tools where we would mix audio and video all at once. So like I said, the problem with the big table is that it was really big and really hard to transport. So at some point, some people started asking for it, and me and Drew were like, okay, we have to come up with something that does pretty much the same thing, but is a lot more portable. And this is also, it's going to be pretty funny because it draws to a point where I was going to say at some point that sometimes technology can start projects and sometimes art can start projects. So sometimes I see something, a tool, and I'm like, we should use this to create sound or use this to do something with video or audio, and sometimes it's the opposite. I want to do something and I look for the technology to do it. So once I was watching a UK TV show called Fur TV, and there was a battle of DJs in the show, and they had this super high-tech DJ that came from Japan, and he was using a cube to mix all his music. I found that to be really inspiring because usually DJs, they use either CDs, well nowadays they use time-coded vinyl and stuff like that, or vinyl. And so there was this part of physicality that I really liked, and so when I saw the cubes, I thought the cubes could be good to contain media. So I looked for the technology that would work with it, ended up going for RFID chips and readers, and we built this interface with cubes where every time you flip it, you change samples, and you also have effects that you can control. Again, it's a performance tool. There are 2 interfaces that talk to each other. One does video, one does audio, and that also creates a dialogue between 2 performers.
Okay, cool. Okay, so this panel has become technology heavy here. So I have a quick question for you and a quick question for you, and then we'll open up to question and answer from our audience, which we have quite an audience here. So Frank, the question to you in my head sort of is a little bit, what makes, one of your strengths, I'll say, is how you look at visuals in film. I mean, this is a film panel. It doesn't seem to be, but it is. And then what about it creating sounds for film in terms of what makes you good at that?
Well, as a composer, or I'm also kind of an architect also, from my music experiences, I love to see my music come together in composing. I hear it in my head and I create it. And I do the same thing with buildings. I've had to create several houses to work out of. I built a commercial building in Venice. And it's an idea that you have in your head, and then all of a sudden it materializes into brick and mortar. So creating sound effects is very much the same way. It's a lot of it has to do with the experimental process and experience. Through time, with this analog evolution into the digital revolution, and where we are now with synthesizers. I used to create sounds by turning knobs, and I used to own 55 synthesizers, analog synthesizers, everything under the sun. They were stacked to the roof. And all these MIDI controllers and all these connections to put them all together, and one keyboard would control 55 synthesizers. Well, now it's a different story. And as the revolution and evolution of electronic synthesis has gotten to this point, a lot of the analog world is not really kind of relevant because of the way to interface them with modern computers, and the way that I used to create sounds for like Star Trek or Tron. Now, for the last 10 years or 15 years, every synthesizer has been modeled. The Moog has been modeled. The ARP synthesizers have been modeled. So there's a company called Arturia that have basically, they have gained the rights to all of the synthesizers from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they've taken all the circuitry and they've emulated every one of those synthesizers into the computers. Well, one of the problems with that is, for me, is that I don't like to create sounds with a mouse. I really come from the keyboard background and being able to touch a knob and turn a knob. Well, what Arturia has done is created a new synthesizer called the Origin, where they've taken every synthesizer that ever exists. They own the rights to the circuitries of all of those. They, for instance, Bob Moog went back to this company and he redesigned the Moog in digital form because there are many things that that analog could not do. So he went back into the circuitry now that it was digital, and he was able to actually open envelopes, and you could, when you turned the knob, it would do something that he always wanted it to do, but a capacitor wouldn't be able to do it for him. So now I have like the reincarnation of all my best friends all in one box. And I can turn a knob just like I did 30 years ago, and it creates the sound. So all of the past is coming together and consolidating into this new digital revolution and control interfaces where I can do everything I've always wanted to do, where I had 55 synthesizers and wires and connectors and boxes and all of these things that it took for me to be able to interface all of these synthesizers. They're all now into one box. And a beautiful computer animation of those old synthesizers. And when I turn the knob, it turns the knob on the computer graphic and so on. So now it's a whole different game, really. And also just the libraries that are available. It used to be that I had to go out and create all my own sounds. And I still do, just because I'm also a content provider and I sell libraries. But the libraries that are available to me now are enormous because the recording tools are very much like what Alan is recording on here, these little Samson Zoom H4Ns or whatever they're.
Digital 5.1 surround in a little box like this.
Yeah, full surround capabilities for $100. The average kid can go out and create sound. So these libraries, not only on the sound effects side, but on the music side, like for instance the Vienna Symphony Library. They've taken the Vienna Symphony, which is one of the greatest orchestras in the world, took them 3 years to take every violin, every instrument in the orchestra and record them perfectly in an anechoic environment. And then what they have done is they've created so that on a electronic keyboard, which is really my instrument, I've studied keyboard my whole life, and I still gravitate towards that interface because I know how to play piano and I know how to play keyboards. But what they have done is they've allowed all the expressive elements of that instrument so that you can play it with your left hand, the expressive parts, and with your right hand you can play the actual music. So you can, the way that a violin back bows, I mean there's many aspects of a violin and how it's played, and you can hear older electronic music, you can really kind of, you know it when you hear it. You go, oh, that's a synthesizer playing an orchestral thing. But it's become so sophisticated now that many times when I watch television, I know that it's electronic, but I'm like going, wait a second, is that really? That sounds like a real orchestra there. It used to be I could always tell, but now it's getting to the point of where the expression is so incredible. And the way that they've recorded these instruments are so incredible that you cannot tell anymore. And I think in the next 20 years to come, we're just going to get further and further into it. And the libraries are getting better. The recording techniques are getting better. The resolution quality is getting better. One of the problems with digital in the 8-bit and the 16-bit era is when sounds were manipulated, either slowed down or sped up, there was a degradation that went along with it. Now with the high bit resolution and the kilobit resolution, we can stretch those sounds way out. You know, it's like pixels. When you enlarge a big picture and you have lots of pixels, you don't have the degradation in the picture. The same holds true in sound. So that's what's happening. We're getting higher resolution, the interfaces are getting better, and the creativity is going through the roof. Because one of the problems that I always had in the last 30 years is the technical aspects become a brick wall when you're trying to be creative. You go up against, oh my God, I got to hook up 40 cables to do that, you know? And much of the creative process is hampered by the technical process. So by eliminating a lot of that technical, the technical problems, you're able to just get right down to the creative. And a lot of these controllers and all of these libraries and instruments are really helping.
That's certainly true in TV
process.
stations. So here we are.
Interesting point that's very true is that over the last 10 years, there's been a rebirth in actual, honest-to-God, analog digital synthesizers, those kind that you used to talk about with the hundreds of cables. There are actually more companies manufacturing and selling analog digital synthesizers today than there were during the heyday of analog synthesizers during the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, okay, that's true too. Okay, yeah, you two do something on the future again of where kind of it's going.
Well, I would like to respond to, you know, as somebody who I always have considered myself a tech chick. I've always considered myself somebody who's interested in doing art with technology. And I've watched from, you know, when technology as an artist was kind of a cult thing. I like to say I went from when it was a cult to where it became a brand. And it's become a thing where jumping on the bandwagon and having the best thing and having the most inclusive thing is the art. And I almost feel that what's happening now is almost like a reaction to that, where people want to go back to the human touch. It's like we know how masterfully we can use technology to simulate the world around us, but we want to feel the human touch with that medium. And so I like this panel, Art and Technology, where art is about taking technology with us into the world that we humans can create, and only humanity can create. You know, a world that is good for life, a world that is good for relationships, a world that is good for the future. So that's my response, is I appreciate the mastery. The art is in what we do with that mastery.
People managed to make pretty decent art before there was, you know, 24-bit, 196K digital audio.
That is a whole other subject. We started off waking up this morning talking about that.
The first technology applied to art was fire.
You
take a piece of wood, you burn the end off of it, so you've got a nice bit of carbon, and then you can make a good mark.
Doesn't it all get down to symmetry and harmony and math anyway?
Haven't they always been associated, art and technology? From the very first stick that we wove in the air with the embers.
We were talking about that this morning. The pyramids, people don't realize, but the pyramids were musical instruments.
Really?
And
you mean people could play them?
Well, they were called the flutes of God.
Oh, the sound inside.
The sound inside. They were positioned in a way that the desert winds would blow through the vent holes. And down in the chambers would create what was called the Om. And that's really kind of like the first, I mean, if we look at technology and the way
But it was analog.
It was way analog.
It was a wind instrument.
Pre-analog.
But you know, it's interesting. You know, that the technology is becoming almost invisible. I mean, where's the computer? Right? It's not just a piece of glass. Like here, we can play with different. If you like the circular design, we can do that, or we can go towards the more classical piano like this, and play like this, or now you can even do a spiral kind of piano. And so your choice of keyboard, your interface is becoming very fluid with this technology. And so,
as well as what the keys mean even, I bet.
Yeah, and you can probably map some of the keys in some of these programs as well. So on that, I'm going to open it up finally to question answer. We just need a whole nother program for all of this. So does anybody have any questions to our panel? I'm sure. Oh, good. We have a question.
As someone who works at the Carmel Bach Festival with lots of violinists, I had a question about sort of the issue that you raised, which is about what is lost because mastery. When you do away with mastery, one of the things that I see, and I'm into classical music with traditional and non-traditional orchestras. One of the things that I see that's valuable that you bring to the artistic process is mastery. So as we all know, you go online and there is the entire, I mean, a lot of it is not masterful. A lot of it is not interesting. A lot of it is just stuff. And you can pick up millions of these little gadgets and you can push them and they produce things, visual and oral. But I sort of wonder, in all of this move towards greater technology and gadgets, what is lost when you don't have those 10,000 hours to sit there and master in your body with physical objects? You know, what's lost? And I guess it's a question like, has anyone here actually sat and thought through that? What is the what's lost when you don't spend those 10,000 hours with your violin practicing in the art form itself?
So, Peter,
well, I think about that a lot. As I said, as I'm an academic, I get to waste my time thinking about things rather than running around making money. And one of the things you have to realize is that you're working with the Monterey Bach Festival, not the Monterey Salieri Festival. What you have is when we think of mastery, we think of the very best of what has been. And we don't realize that in the era of Bach and then in any era, the experts, the real experts, are the ones we remember. But there were as many people running around doing poor organ recitals, improvising in church and getting lost, and all of the kinds of low-grade stuff that we kind of worry about, that we see on the internet, and we say, oh, so much of that is terrible. But in fact, after a time, the good stuff rises. And yes, we're putting a large burden on our future musicians because we're changing the game. The same thing happened over 200 years ago when we went from the classical musical instrument designs until the BAME system in musical instrument designs. It took more than 2 generations to completely make a transition to where people were as masterful with the BAME flute as they had been with the classical flute. And we had the same sort of arguments about technology has ruined it, and you can't do that. And I don't know if you realize that the mellotron was actually outlawed by the American Musicians Union. Yeah.
We're always fighting with them.
Right, yes.
But they finally joined me.
We have these things. We have to, and it just takes time. It takes thought on the part of people building them, but then once you build something, give it to a student, the student will start learning it.
Yeah, and I'd like to say one thing on that. These are Promethean devices. They are whatever we make them to be. And I don't see why music should be solely the domain of audio. Why can't we have multisensory music? These technologies make that possible. All we need is the creativity to do that.
I think the bigger question is there a one-to-one relationship between art and the difficulty required to produce it? Is art better if you have to spend 10,000 hours learning how to make it than if there were tools that allow you to get that artistic impulse you have out in your head easier? Is the value in the art, or is it in, oh my God, that person's doing something I couldn't conceivably do? Isn't that amazing?
But the technology has allowed the artist to learn quicker
exactly.
as well.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
You look at all these programs where kids learn how to play piano, well like video games now. Well, we never had that. Now they can very quickly and accelerate the learning process of how to learn music, which is different than...
to do with motivation as much as anything.
Well, by the way, we're just about out of time, and I did want to read this one thing from this magazine called Juxtaposition. My sister Danielle brought this morning. This got us starting to talk about the pyramids. But it's talking about loops, and loops in audio, loops in video, whatever. It is a loop that allows a system to perceive itself, to become self-aware. By virtue of having a loop, a formal system acquires a self. The key to consciousness is not the stuff out of which brains are made or musical instruments are made, but the patterns that could come to exist inside the stuff of a brain. An I comes about via a kind of a cortex, whereby patterns in a brain mirror the brain's mirroring of the world and eventually mirror themselves, whereupon the vortex of I becomes a reality. How's that? How's that for an exit? So in other words, it gets back to the art thing. Why do we do art? You know, we mirror ourselves with the mathematics, and so this is a whole, that's our next program. Let's see, we have only a few seconds.
Do you have time for one more question?
Okay, sure.
Make it quick.
Okay.
Drew, if I understood you correctly, you said that you had spent some time in social documentary work, focusing on video. And I wonder if you could, within the next minute or less, tell us a little bit about how technology has made that whole process of producing a documentary easier, quicker, faster, better.
In about 10 seconds you have. So.
Yeah, I would just say it's amazing that basically I'm able now to take small portable cameras and give every student in the class a camera, and then they can immediately take that footage, shoot it raw, and then upload it. In this case, we upload it to CNN iReport. So stories directly out of the favela of Rocinha went directly to a major news media network where they're archived and stored. And I couldn't have done that even 3-4 years ago.
And that's about it. So that really, we need to do another show like this. And thank you for all of you for coming and for being on the panel. And we'll do it again. Okay?
Thank you, Denise.